welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are inspiring the future, shaping our world, inspiring future creators, and for all those that like really great stories. I'm Ira Pastor, your life sciences ambassador along for the journey today. So as viewers of the show know, a couple episodes ago, we discussed the topic of the Holocene Extinction, this ongoing extinction event of species in this present epoch as a result of human activity. And as part of this, the disappearance of these large land animals known as megafauna, most commonly used for the largest extent terrestrial animals, but including animals like elephants, giraffes, hippopotami, large bovines, rhinos, and of course large apes and large cats. But this is not just limited to us humans messing around with the environment. Trophy hunting is the act of hunting of wild game like these large mammals purely for human recreation. The trophy is technically the animal or part of the animal that is kept and displayed to display the success of the hunt. Over the past decade, it is estimated the hunters have taken home 1.7 million trophies from animals they killed for sport. More than 200,000 of them were animals that were in danger of going extinct, including 10,000 lions. Including the very well publicized case of Cecil the Lion in Zimbabwe. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES for short, is a multilateral treaty that was designed to protect endangered plants and animals. Originally, the aim, as it was crafted a few decades ago, was to ensure international trade of specimens of wild animals and plants that threaten their survival. However, there is an unfortunate loophole in this agreement where endangered species technically can still be hunted by trophy hunters, even though poachers technically cannot kill, say, an elephant and sell its tusks, but a trophy hunter can kill that same elephant and display it. We're honored today to be joined by Eduardo Goncalves. Now, he is founder of the Campaign to Ban Trophy Hunting, which is a nonprofit group that believes trophy hunting is cruel, archaic, immoral, unjustified, and ultimately inflicts significant pain and suffering, undermines conservation efforts, and brings no benefit at all to communities. The organization wants to see an immediate halt to trade in trophies of vulnerable and threatened species. They call on governments to ban trophy hunting and import and export of hunted trophies, and ultimately believe there should be a comprehensive global agreement in banning trophy hunting with proper enforcement penalties. Prior to the Campaign to Ban Trophy Hunting, Mr. Goncalves was the chief executive officer of the League Against Cruel Sports, where he led a very successful campaign to stop plans to bring back fox hunting, ultimately, as well as to persuade the government in the UK to increase jail sentences for dog fighting and breeding and shipping of such dogs. He also spent several years at the World Wildlife Fund, working in both forest conservation and sustainability. His wide-ranging career also includes roles in the House of Commons as a researcher, as a radio presenter, an investigative journalist, and a director of a government department in the United Arab Emirates. He's an author and co-author of several books, including Killing Game, The Extinction Industry, Trophy Hunters Exposed, Inside the Big Game Industry, the World Wildlife Fund Pocketbook of One Planet Living, The Algarve Tiger, and The Blueprint for a Nuclear Weapon-Free World. A lot to talk about. Eduardo, thank you for taking the time to come on the show today and talk to us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, thank you. Typically on the show, we start out basically just by giving our guests the floor for a little bit to talk about themselves. If you would introduce who you are, where you grew up, how you got interested in this space of conservation, of species protection, and a little bit of your journey over the last few decades. That'd be a great way to set the stage.
It's a different path to many people's, I think, because you mentioned there a few of the different things I've done over my lifetime, which, although in many ways different, have always had that same thread of conservation, of environment and sustainability. So even when I was a journalist, I'd be writing generally about environmental stories. I was born in the UK, in Britain, of Portuguese parents. And so quite often in the summer, I would come back to Portugal and spend time with my aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents and so on. And I remember at a very young age hearing this van that would come around the neighborhood on, I think it was a Saturday, and it had a megaphone blaring out this advertisement for bullfighting. And that was the first time I kind of came across it. And then you'd actually see it on TV, often on primetime TV, on the state-owned TV channel here in Portugal. And I just couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand why you would want to make fun of and torment and torture a bull, even though in Portuguese bullfighting you don't actually kill the bull in the ring, which is what you do in Spanish bullfighting. But it's still a process of humiliation, of domination, of, well, essentially an approach to animals and other living things that just seemed fundamentally wrong to me. And discussing it with my family, I mean, I was 7 or 8 at the time, but I'd be discussing this with my family and they all agreed with me. And they also couldn't understand it. And in fact, quite a few of my family members, cousins particularly, are quite involved in animal welfare issues to this day. So that was kind of the first spark. And also because, you know, I grew up in a very inner city area of London, a very sort of, you know, poor and rural area, urban area rather. And I kind of longed to get out of it because I was just felt, you know, trapped, imprisoned. And I read about this boarding school in the countryside, but he had to take an exam to go there. He had to get very high marks and all the rest of it. And I actually researched this. I mean, I was 10 years old at the time. I researched it and I got myself into the exam and I took the exam and I got a place. So from the ages of 11 and 18, I was living in effect and studying in one of the most rural areas of the UK. And it was actually a former farm. And all around it were other farms, and there were woodlands and copses and streams and rivers and so on. And so I used to spend a lot of my time, not entirely on the school grounds, but on the adjacent areas. And just, it was where I always, you know, felt at home. And even when I then, you know, started, if you like, my professional career, in fact, one of the first things was, you briefly touched on this, I presented actually what was the first environmental news program or segment on a commercial radio station in the UK. And then I sort of, you know, got involved in working for non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, but then went back into journalism and was working on environmental and conservation issues, and ended up leading an organization that was trying to stop the first ever extinction of a big cat in modern times. And this was of an animal called the Iberian Lynx. The Iberian Lynx is a separate species. It's related to the bobcat. It's, you know, a cousin of the Canadian lynx, but it is a separate species. It's one of the 36 or 37 wild feline species that exist on Earth. And it had undergone a precipitous collapse in numbers. So at the beginning of the 20th century, there was about 100,000. By the end of the 20th century, there were less than 100 of these animals. And there were none in captivity. And that meant that there was no prospect of being able to start an immediate breeding program in order to return animals to the wild, reintroduce them, and so on. And there was a great deal of disagreement, mainly amongst politicians and the authorities, both in Spain and in Portugal, which is the only place the Iberian lynx exists. It's in fact Western Europe's only endemic big cat species. And this was actually one of the reasons why a lot of conservation groups were quite unwilling to get involved in it. A, because they looked at the numbers and thought, well, this animal is gone and we don't want to be associated with failure. Secondly, it was going to be very difficult for those same big conservation charities to be able to raise funds or raise the alarm for conservation in other parts of the world, and indeed to not quite dictate, but certainly to sort of instruct or tell governments in other parts of the world, in Asia or in Africa, that, you know, they needed to be working harder to protect their wildlife and protect their habitats, if at the same time Europe was to lose its only single wild cat species. And so there was a lot of disagreement between the authorities about whether to start a breeding program. And in fact, I kind of used my position, if you like, as a journalist to really raise the alarm. And I read a lot of stories about it. And then I also teamed up with the guy who was the producer of BBC's Life on Earth series with David Attenborough. and so wrote a book, with photos. It was the first book that had ever been written either in English or in Portuguese about this species. And for the first time, I had photos. It was we worked with a photographer who'd spent basically 4 years of his life on his stomach photographing this small population in a sandy area of southwest Spain. And it's the easiest area to find them because of the sand. You could follow their footprints and so on. And, we brought that book out, and suddenly, things went big. And actually, within a couple of weeks, the authorities finally agreed to start a captive breeding program by taking the runts of the litter, which they would find in the wild. So a cub that wouldn't expect to survive in the wild naturally, you would take that, remove it, and bring this into this the first center was in the zoo of Jerez in the southwest Spain, and then eventually spread, and they started using the main center that had been built some years earlier for breeding down in the Hwange National Park, and so on. So fortunately, it worked. And now there's about 500 or 600 back in the wild. And there's more than half a dozen of these breeding centers working extremely well, and they're exchanging the animals, because of course with so few animals left in the wild, the gene pool was very narrow. So there's a real problem with potential inbreeding and all the issues that could bring about, whether it's diseases and so on. Anyway, it's all been managed incredibly well by these fantastic professionals who've been running the program. And now you've got these, centers, and they're swapping the animals in order to, try and diversify as much as possible the gene pool. And the species is on the up. So it's one of the few sort of success stories that we've had in recent times. But anyway, so, and actually the reason I got into it, bizarrely enough, so I'm talking to you now from a small holding, so a small farm that I have in southern Portugal. Okay. And it's mainly cork forests, so that's the main thing that I grow here and sell. So cork comes from cork oak trees, and every 10 years you strip the outer bark, and then it grows back. And the trees live for about 200 years. It's a fantastically wildlife-friendly form of farming, because you've basically got this fantastic, old woodland with minimal intervention, literally. You might prune it every now and again, but essentially all you're doing is every 10 years, a guy with a special rounded axe removes the outer bark very skillfully and piles it, carries it up the hill and puts it in a pile to dry and so on. And anyway, I discovered completely by chance that my small holding was actually on a key habitat corridor for the Iberian lynx. So I'm sort of in between two mountain ranges. I'm in the lower foothills of one. And there's a river and a valley that goes along here. And anyway, this would be one of the main routes by which the young Iberian lynxes would disperse and then go on to settle their own territories and to find mates and to breed and so on and so forth.
Sure.
And I had literally not heard about this animal until I moved in on the farm, and I read about this by accident. And I also discovered that one of the main habitats was in fact the cork forests. And at the same time, there was this very big drive by certain interests linked to the wine industry to actually switch from natural cork to synthetic corks, to metal screw caps and so on. And this posed a potential threat to the whole cork forest ecosystem, and of course all the species that depend on it. And there's many birds of prey and many other mammals that live in this habitat. So anyway, I guess that's a sort of a long way of saying that this has always been part of who I am, of where I've been, what I've tried to do, and I suppose my whole life has been sort of a struggle to understand how can we as a species, as a human race, live in harmony with our surroundings and alongside our fellow creatures. Because as far as I'm concerned, we have as much right to roam this earth as they do, and they have as much right as we do. And therefore we have to find a way to peacefully coexist. And it seems almost as if we've been waging a war for centuries, not even just in recent times, but for centuries, in clearing areas and destroying habitats and deliberately wiping out predators and so on and so forth. Whereas actually, the system was developed or was created, whichever way you approach it, in a way to work harmoniously as one single living entity. Sure. And kind of the end part of the journey was, I suppose, trophy hunting, because of all the threats, and there are many, many threats that wildlife face today, but of all the threats that wildlife faces, it seems to me that trophy hunting is the stupidest, it's the most senseless, it's the most unnecessary, and it's the most deliberately cruel. and frankly evil, if I can use that word, because it is, as you said in your introduction there, it is something that is done purely for recreation. It is killing an animal, it is frightening it, chasing it, torturing it, etc., and then ultimately killing it purely for our own amusement, for entertainment, for us to take pleasure out of, and then to gloat by taking that animal or a body part of it and displaying it as a prowess, as our success in having accomplished this feat, which is no great feat given that most people are now shooting these animals from 200 yards away with a high-powered rifle. Or in the case of canned hunting, which is where you breed animals in captivity, like lions, you breed them in captivity and then you hunt them within an enclosure. That's right. That's not hunting, and I mean that's just shooting. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. Right. It's or shooting a zoo animal. These animals are tame, and I've seen so many bits of footage where essentially the hunter walks right up to the animal. They're about 8 or 9 yards away, and they shoot it, and the animal is just there saying, "Oh, have you come to bring me my dinner?" They're used to humans. They associate them with being their keepers and their feeders. And so as far as they're concerned, they're not a threat. They've lost that natural fear of humans. And so, it is, I mean, this is the most cowardly form of hunting and animal abuse imaginable, but it is a part of the industry that's really booming. So something like 10 to 12,000 lions are currently sitting in cages in South Africa, waiting for the person to come and shoot them. Now, bear in mind, there's only 20,000 wild lions left. So the growth of this industry has been absolutely extraordinary. And they're not just using lions now. So right now, and this is one of the things I've written about in my latest book, there's companies where in Africa, where you can go and shoot tigers that have been bred in captivity and kept. So tigers don't even belong in Africa. Right, they're not from India. And the same happens with jaguars. In fact, they've even had Eurasian lynxes and bobcats and cougars in southern Africa, bred in captivity for a hunter to go and shoot for fun and to stick the trophy on their wall. So it seems to me, that there are many very complex issues facing humanity and the human condition. It seems to me that trophy hunting is almost like a litmus test of our inability to fully comprehend our role as it should be on Earth, and to find a harmonious relationship in symphony with other living creatures. Because if we don't fundamentally crack that one, then we're lost. We're in deep trouble. And we can see that in so many ways, through problems with pollution, through climate change, etc., etc., etc. And the resource, there's the farming industry is now telling us that soil degradation is such that we may only have 60 harvests left on Earth. Mm. This is how badly we are treating the planet. And if anything, trophy hunting is the worst example of it. So if we can finally get our heads around trophy hunting and realize that this is something just so perverse and so fundamentally wrong, and that we have to stop it, maybe that will actually help us to recognize the fullness of our destructive powers and the wrongness of the path that we have chosen in so many respects, and we can start to find the answers and the right path towards finding that harmonious relationship that we absolutely need to find. It's not a desirable, it's an essential if the human race alone is to survive, let alone thrive.
I appreciate all of that, and it's a it's a fascinating intro to everything you're doing now, and talking about this sort of theme of respect and understanding sort of the interrelationness of all of these systems. And before we get into the organization, I just wanted to throw this one question out there, and I don't know if this is sort of in your purview. If not, we can go on from it. But have you done a couple episodes ago? I was just thinking about this. We did a show with the the head of the United States Center for Disease Control, who focuses on violence, specifically human-on-human violence, where we talked about the fact that in this country alone, every year 40,000 people there's 40,000 homicides. Humans like killing humans, but even if you take that out, a decade. It still doesn't get anywhere near this 1.7 million that we're wiping out of these large species. Why do we hunt these species in the first place? I mean, is there? I mean, the folks CDC are studying why we're hunting each other at these levels. Why do we do that? I mean, I know this may sound like a silly question, but have you done any sort of like, have people done the psychology behind, why somebody has the passion to go shoot a lion in the head, or the same thing to see elephants as well? Is there something that hasn't been discovered, or something that is deeper here that we should be concerned about, especially when, I'm not a hunter. I don't fish either, but I can look at a face of a lion or an elephant or whatnot, and realize, I don't care what some people. This is a sentient. This is a sentient organism here. You have to look at the eyes. Why are we hunting these organisms anyway?
Right. Firstly, just make a distinction, because when we talk about trophy hunting, it's not the same as hunting for food.
Sure.
Not, subsistence hunting. It's not meeting any material need. So, for example, when we talk about polar bear hunting, there's 3 types of polar bear hunting that goes on at the moment. So one is the hunting by the local Inuits, who take a very small number, and it's for skins and for the fat and so on. And of course, they're living in an environment that is quite challenging, very hostile. You're not exactly going to be able to plow up that ice and grow crops, etc.
Sure.
And there's a certain sort of ritual to it as well, but actually it is very, very limited, and they treat bears with respect. Then there's the second kind, where it is a commercial trade in polar bear hunting. And this is where huge numbers of animals are being killed for their skins to be sent off to China, particularly, because it's a luxury item. So there's a volume of commercial trade. And then there's the third type of hunting of polar bears. And I just use this as an example, but you could say the same about pretty much any species, where there's the trophy hunting of polar bears, and that is done by people from everywhere, America, Europe, etc. And it's just for the sport, and it's so that they can put the head and the skin or whatever back in their homes and display it. And so trophy hunting is one very specific type of hunting in that spectrum, or in those categories of hunting. And it is the one where I would suggest that your question is right to raise concern, because although with the first group, the Inuits, you can define some kind of human need there, and possibly an important cultural right. With the second group, although I think it's absolutely wrong to have commercial trade in polar bear skins or of any kind of animal body part, one can sort of understand that there's an economic rationale, and we live in a free market economy, etc. So there's a sort of a motivator that is in accordance with social norms, shall we say. But with the third group, the trophy hunters, it's driven by pleasure. And that is what should give us cause for concern. And in the first book that I wrote about trophy hunting, the psychology of trophy hunting is one of the issues that I look at, as well as the links between that type of behavior and serious and violent forms of crime, because there is a real overlap. I mean, there are many serial killers who are also trophy hunters, and the way that they would stalk their victims, whether human or animal, was almost identical, and how they would keep a part of the body of their victim, whether human or animal, again, very much the same. And there's also research which shows that if you expose children to trophy hunting and to other forms of animal abuse and exploitation of that kind, then they're much more likely to be troubled as youngsters and be involved in arson, and then to be involved in violence and so on. There's greater proportions of abuse of children in areas with higher proportions of trophy hunters. At the start of the hunting season, there's always a big spike in domestic violence. So there's all of these factors and relationships, which a lot of psychologists and even, in fact, consultants and people within the FBI, for example, have actually looked at as a predictor for violent crime. In fact, animal cruelty and dog fighting, for instance, is now classed as a grade A felony by the FBI.
Sure.
Because in large part, it is seen as a very accurate way of being able to predict or to apprehend offenders who are involved in very serious crimes, whether it's drugs, slavery, people trafficking, and so on. And I remember having conversations with the assistant district attorney of Virginia some time ago, who was actually one of the people who was instrumental in making the FBI adopt that policy position, and the examples that she gave. And also when I was talking to the New York police, again, some time ago, when I was looking into the issues around dogfighting in the UK, and they were saying, actually, they were finding more drugs and guns when they were going after dog fighters than if they were looking for drugs and guns on their own.
Wow.
It was, and I had a conversation with some senior officials at the Ministry of Justice in the UK when I was getting them to try to adopt a stricter stance on animal cruelty and dog fighting, which you refer to in your introduction. And it was very interesting, actually, because when I came into the room, there were these two quite senior civil servants, and they consented to have a meeting with me. But you could tell in the look in their eyes, they're thinking, oh, look, we're going to give this guy from the animal welfare group, whatever, we'll give him 20 minutes, we'll pretend to, and then we'll give him a commemorative pen, and we've done our duty. And what actually happened, I said to them, did you know we are currently monitoring people who are involved in dog fighting, who are also recruiting young men into radical Islam and becoming potential terrorists? Well, it was like I'd applied an electric charge to the officials in the room, because they sat up, bolt upright, and they were like, what? And then I sort of went into and explained. In fact, I've got a criminal justice background as well. I used to work in the criminal justice system too for a while. And so the motivators of crime and how you address them, it was something that's always been of interest to me. And I explained, some of these relationships. And it was actually as a result of explaining those links that the government made that decision, that it was going to increase the tariff of, for people involved in dog fighting and other cruelty from 6 months to 5 years in jail, because they understood that actually this wasn't just sort of some second league, peripheral issue.
Right.
It was actually fundamental to the safety of the community. And those people who've done research, and in fact, I was sort of involved in some discussions with hunters on some of their closed forums, and where they actually explain their motives. And a lot of it's all about pleasure. It's about the thrill of it. It's about the adrenaline rush. There's so much talk about the adrenaline rush. And the other thing which keeps coming up again and again and again is the addiction. Is that like an addiction? And in fact, there was a leading British trophy hunter who I talk about in my first book. And in fact, he's giving this interview on a video thing a few weeks ago. And he actually he explains his love of trophy hunting as being akin to being addicted to heroin. He actually says the words, it is just like mainlining on heroin. It's an addiction and it's so difficult to break. And actually, he's not the only person who says that. A lot of the hunters that I've been looking at and looked at their biographies and so on, and what they've said, and there are certain books where they show off their trophy rooms. Some of them have enormous with 2,000, 4,000, 6,000 animal body parts on display, and it's a bit like Hello magazine, where you have a star that's sort of relaxing at home and telling them about their career as a film star. And this is the trophy hunters doing exactly the same, in their home with these big, ivory elephant tusks around them, and you've got some of them even got tigers, and they've got a lion's head behind them and a full polar bear next to them, and then they'll arrange families so they'll sometimes like kill an entire family of an animal, and then rearrange the bodies of them as if they're a happy family that's still alive, and they recreate the environment. In order to, and they actually use these words, I promise you, in order to bring the scene to life. So they've killed these living creatures, and then they've recreated a living scenario with these animals to make it pretty, and to be able to say, look, I dominated, I excelled, and there's a lot about costly signaling, what the psychologists say about, this is essentially males showing off to other males, this is how much wealth I've got, this is my power. Because going trophy hunting ain't cheap. If you're going to go on a let's say a wild lion and elephant hunt in Tanzania for 3 weeks, you could be paying $100,000. And if you're one of these guys who really wants a black rhino, then you're talking about $300,000-$400,000. Houston Safari Club, that's one of the biggest trophy hunting associations in the world. They did a survey of their members, and they found that the average net worth of their members was something like $2.5 million. So these are people with means, and trophy hunting is a way of showing those means off. Because and so there's a complex psychology there, but it is driven by addiction, by the wanting to show off, by and at the bottom line, and this is reflected in the advertisements that are used by the industry.
Sure.
It's the thrill of it. It's the enjoyment of the whole experience, not just the kill, but it's the whole, stalking. If you're, frankly, if you're going after a canned animal, there's not much stalking, is there? But anyway, supposedly it's being out there in the wild, feeling that you're connecting with your sort of, inner caveman or whatever.
Right.
And of course, traditional societies never killed animals for sport. Hunting, when it took place, was a rare and only necessary thing. So, and you see this actually. One of the things I came across recently were, and some people were quite shocked actually about this, but there was manuals that were actually written by WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, paid for by Safari Club International, which is the biggest trophy hunting industry group. And they were pamphlets and manuals designed for local African villagers. And what they do is they explain what trophy hunting is, because this is an entirely foreign concept to African rural communities. You hunt animals for, you only go out and try and hunt an animal if you're really hungry, you have to, etc. No, they had to explain first of all what trophy hunting was, and they're actively encouraging those African communities to help the trophy hunting companies get the biggest animals and shoot as many animals as possible. And this actually caused quite a bit of a stir, because a lot of people who support the World Wildlife Fund, and actually this included quite a few of my former colleagues, and I didn't know when I was working there, they would have assumed that an organization like WWF did not endorse or condone, let alone be actively involved, making trophy hunting possible. And in fact, it's funding quite a few projects. And so a lot of people started cancelling their donations and in fact asking for their money back, because here you had a situation where on the one hand they'd be doing very powerful, emotive adverts on TV saying, send us money to help save this rhino, to help save this leopard. In the same breath, they're writing letters to the Namibian government saying, yes, we support the hunting of black rhinos, even though they're critically endangered. Or we're involved in this program with many hunting companies where you can shoot leopards and lions and giraffes and zebras and so on and so forth. So it was kind of like a real wake-up call. Anyway, in the UK at least, the World Wildlife Fund has now actually reversed its position, and it's supporting our campaign, saying there should be no imports of hunting trophies into Britain, as a way of obviously trying to bring an end to this chapter in human history.
Fascinating. No idea about that, but that's eye-opening.
Yeah.
But thank you for that, the background and the thoughts on the psychological component there. Because I really just personally wanted to understand more, but I think that's a very important piece of it. Let's, one of the things that you deal with on a routine basis is a lot of these misconceptions about sort of trophy hunting, and some of these are listed on your website, and I just quickly go into them, and I'll give you the floor to sort of walk through these. But basically, these concepts that trophy hunting can be beneficial to conservation, it can create jobs, like we were just talking about, that it's mainly habitat destruction that's important, the hunting is not. There could be negative consequences if we don't get rid of some of these species. And then most importantly, and related to sort of this loophole issue in CITES, that regulations are strong, and we know they're not. Walk us through a little bit about sort of how you have to sort of counteract these misconceptions in your in your job as the CEO, in creating a broader, more precise understanding of what the truth is behind all of this. I think these 5 points are very important in your mission.
If trophy hunting was so great for conservation, then why aren't scientists advocating it and clamoring for it for tigers? Why aren't we going and using trophy hunting as a means to bring back the Iberian lynx? Why aren't we endorsing it for conservation of great apes or the orangutan? It's utter nonsense, and obviously it's utter nonsense. And what has happened with trophy hunting and conservation is that, look, trophy hunting, what I show in my second book, The Killing Game, The Extinction Industry, is that trophy hunting is probably the single biggest cause of the decline of many of these wildlife species that are still so popular with trophy hunters today. From the beginnings of the industry as we know it today, the modern industry from the 19th century, and when the British went down to Africa and India, and this became the new fad, the new sport for these gentlemen. And then in the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt took it to a next level when he first of all went on a year-long hunting trip around Africa, and then other Americans started following, and the steamship passages were cheaper, and there were now some new railroads in Africa where you could get to places and hire African slaves in effect, but porters and so on to work with you. And you look at, for example, let's take elephants. So at the beginning of the 19th century, there was about 20 million elephants. By the beginning of the 20th century, it'd gone down to about 10 million, and then beginning of this century, there's less than 500,000. And the numbers of elephants that have been shot over the years are absolutely huge. They're colossal. And the individual numbers of elephants shot by people, and I document some of the colonial hunters. They'd be shooting hundreds of hundreds of lions, hundreds of rhinos, hundreds of elephants, etc. But modern day trophy hunters still do the same. We take, there's a chap called Ron Thompson from Zimbabwe. He shot over 5,000 elephants. He's still alive, so he's a modern day hunter. There's a guy in Spain called Tony Sanchez Areno. Over his lifetime, he's shot 1,317 elephants, 340 lions, and then thousands of buffaloes and leopards and black rhinos and other animals as well. He's got at least 4,000 kills. There's another Spaniard, Marcel Gomez Siqueira, who's been on 500 safari hunting trips, and he's killed animals from 400 different species. And this is something that is actively encouraged by the industry. The Safari Club International is not alone in this, but it has many awards which are given to hunters which shoot a minimum number of animals in different parts of the world or with different weapons and so on and so forth. So, for example, if you want to win the Africa 29 prize, you've got to shoot 29 different species of animal from Africa. If you want to get the Cats of the World prize, you have to shoot basically one of every single wild cat species, barring the tiger and one or two others from around the world. You've got a menu, literally you get given a menu of animals to shoot from. And there's some prizes which you're only eligible for if you've shot 100 different species or more. And Safari Club has 80 of these individual awards, but so many other organizations do as well. Dallas Safari Club, the Weatherby Foundation, Pope and Young, Boone and Crockett, etc., etc. They have all of these different awards. Now, as well as encouraging people to shoot lots of animals, they also encourage them to shoot the biggest animals. So it's the reverse, if you like, of natural selection. It's artificial selection. Again, let's take the example of Safari Club International. Its records book, which is something that every trophy hunter wants to get into. It's like the Guinness World Book, Book of World Records for trophy hunting. And to get in there, you've got to shoot animals that have got to be of a certain size. So, for example, if you want to be in there for lions, you've got to score 23. Now, how do you get to the score of 23? Well, when they shoot the lion, they measure the skull in inches. So they add up how long it is with how wide it is. And if the total comes to 23 or more inches, then you're in the records book.
Mm.
Same happens with elephants, African elephants. So you shoot an elephant, you want it to be in the records, but what they do is they weigh the tusks. So take the tusks, they weigh the tusks, and the combined weight of the tusks has got to be 100 pounds. And of course, that means trophy hunters are shooting lots and lots of animals until they finally get the one that's big enough to make the grade, to get it into the book. But what it is also doing, this process of artificial selection, is taking the best genes out of the gene pool of these species, which, you know, there's fewer of them, they're facing multiple threats, and habitat is absolutely one of them. It's not the only one. There's poisoning, there's snares, there's, you know, the so-called human-wildlife conflict and so on. But you're taking the best genes out of a species that's already under threat and whose numbers are already in decline. So you're taking away its ability to be resilient, to be able to survive, to be able to resist those threats and to adapt to them. In the case of African elephants, its tusks are now shrinking. So over the last 30, 40 years, there have been actually a number of studies which have shown this. The average tusks of elephants in the wild have been getting shorter and shorter. In fact, there's many more adult tuskless elephants as well. I've also acquired hunting industry data, which also shows that tusks are getting smaller. And actually, as a result of that, Safari Club International actually had to lower the bar. So they reduced the minimum score that you had to get in order to get your elephant trophies into the records book from 100 pounds to 90 pounds, because hunters just weren't able to find any more elephants that were 100 pounders or more. So, and they were getting very upset about this. And so their response was to do that. And the industry also now it sells these hunts where you can go and shoot tuskless elephants as a special novelty thing. I mean, it's just absolutely bizarre and atrocious. Now, for the case of the African elephant, if it's got shorter tusks, it's going to make it much harder to survive the day-to-day practicalities of accelerating climate change, because those tusks serve a purpose. They're obviously not just decorative, but one of the purposes they serve is to find water under dry riverbeds during drought seasons.
Okay.
And drought is increasingly a factor in Africa, as it is in many parts of the world. And the droughts are getting longer, more fierce, they're more frequent, they're more prolonged, etc., etc. And so more and more animals are dying from drought already. And so this is going to undermine the elephant's ability to be able to cope with those. So it's accelerating that process of extinction, which unfortunately they're already on. And the same is happening with lions. So there was a study a couple of years ago which showed that the gene pool of the lion in Africa had actually shrunk by 15% over the last century. And that, you know, some of the gene strands just no longer existed at all. And so, so that means that, you know, again, lions are going to be more prone to disease and less able to adapt and to survive these changes. In fact, scientists have also calculated that if you shoot just 5% of the remaining adult males out there, that could be enough to push them past the point of no return. And in fact, the US government, the US Fish and Wildlife Service, has already said that it thinks that Africans could actually go extinct in the wild by the year 2050, which isn't very long away at all. So lions and elephants and many other species, they've been driven to this point through, you know, 2 centuries almost of intensive trophy hunting. And they're now down to this remnant species. And now they've got all of these other problems as well, you know, habitat destruction and so-called human-wildlife conflict. And a lot of the best animals no longer exist, or the best genes are no longer there. So it's just, you know, multiplying the problems exponentially. And now, abolishing trophy hunting would, of course, not solve all of the conservation challenges that wildlife today faces, but it takes one of the threats away. It takes one of the pressures, and arguably the one that it's the most senseless, the most needless, and frankly, you know, the most irresponsible pressure that we're adding to wildlife. You know, we don't need to be trophy hunting animals, and if we take that pressure away, it buys us a bit of time. It buys the species a bit of time. It buys us the time and space to maybe put some of those other measures that are needed, you know, to put the species on an even keel. And the science is very clear on this, actually. And a lot of research has been done around lions in particular, and it shows that trophy hunting has proven in many areas to be the single greatest threat to lions. It's the single greatest cause of lion population decline. And the other thing that research around lions and trophy hunting has also shown is when you stop trophy hunting lions, so for example, if there's a moratorium, there have been in Zimbabwe and in Zambia, when you stop for a period of time, the populations bounce right back. And actually they form a more sustainable structure, because if you're shooting incessantly the big males and you're taking all of the big males, you're doing two things. You're skewing the sex ratio. You're causing often greater problems of inbreeding, because then you've sometimes got young cubs mating with their mother. You've got all the problems of infanticide, because then you've got other pride or other males come in and try to take over the pride. Sometimes the females will then run away to escape their attentions. There was actually a case that was documented by Andrew Loveridge, who was the scientist who monitored Cecil, radio-collared Cecil the Lion, and monitored him for years. And he found there was two lionesses that actually went on to a neighboring farm. And they killed a donkey there. They were both shot, and it was found that they had teats, swollen teats, so they were still nursing cubs. So those animals would die, the cubs will have died. So you have this incredible sort of ripple effect. Anyway, so if we take so as well as causing that imbalance in terms of the genders, once you take away trophy hunting, what the scientists found was that the structure of the lion society became more normal, more sustainable, healthier again. You had the right proportion of males to females, the right proportions in terms of age, demographics as well. So look, there is all of this science that says this is why trophy hunting is having an effect, a bad negative effect on wildlife. Nobody has come up with an argument or with evidence to say this is the beneficial impact of trophy. When there've been so many moratoria on trophy hunting, actually, for all sorts of different species and in many different countries, leopards in South Africa and so on and so forth. And they were all because of the declining numbers in those animals as a result of trophy hunting. But if you take the argument that the industry puts forward, then surely the only reason to stop trophy hunting is because it's so successful. And actually, there's now a glut of animals everywhere. And actually, you have to stop trophy hunting in order to stop the whole area being overrun by all these animals that have boomed because of the wonders of trophy hunting. It's nonsense. Let me just give you one. I talked about Cecil. Let me just give you one little case study that I think really sums it up. So, Walter Palmer, the American dentist from Minnesota who shot Cecil the Lion. And the whole thing will have cost him about $50,000, of which $30,000 was the trophy fee. And that is something that is payable to the authorities. It goes to the government, supposedly into the environment ministry, and then gets plowed back into conservation. Well, that's the theory of it. The reality is that no money has ever gone back. I mean, if you looked at all of the elephants that have been hunted in recent years, the funds generated through these trophy fees are somewhere in the order of $2 billion. There is no way that $2 billion has been invested in elephant conservation in Southern Africa. Okay, if you it doesn't happen. Anyway, let's go back to the case of Cecil and Walter Palmer. Palmer will have paid that $30,000 to the government. Now, even if the entirety of those $30,000 was plowed back into the conservation of lions, it wouldn't have come close to the actual cost of conservation, because Andrew Loveridge, again, he's the Oxford University scientist who was monitoring Cecil, and he calculated the actual cost of protecting a lion like Cecil and his habitats is actually going to be about $1 million over his lifetime. So $30,000 is a drop in the ocean. What he does say, and in fact many others have said this, is that the thing that really does generate the funds, and it does go back into the community and create jobs as well, is nature tourism. It's photographic tourism. It employs far more people. It pays them better. The jobs are all year round. So there's greater incentive for them to actually protect wildlife and the environment. But it also generates far more money. So a lion like Cecil can actually generate, through nature tourism and photographic safaris, something like $100,000 a year. So with the lifespan in the wild of a lion being somewhere around 15, you do the math. You're talking about something which actually does pay to conserve. So it literally pays to keep the animal alive in every sense. if you're wanting to conserve them and the habitats that they inhabit.
Excellent, excellent points. In terms of the organization, you know, one thing that, you know, when I read about the band trophy hunting group, as you've set it up, you've been extremely successful in bringing together a lot of these different stakeholders. I see, you know, diplomats and celebrities, politicians. I see Leonardo DiCaprio's name and William Shatner. You've done an extremely good job at sort of organizing this ecosystem of people that are really interested and passionate about this. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you've been so successful at that? I mean, obviously, it's a theme that a lot of people can get behind. Usually on the show, you know, we're talking about a range of topics. I a lot of time do sort of the healthcare related stuff in terms of, you know, these people doing Alzheimer's research and this folks with cancer and so forth. And everyone's always lamenting how they, you know, they can't get, you know, that celebrity or that billionaire to donate 1 penny to solving cancer or whatever. But you seem to have done a very nice job at organizing people from all different sectors to get behind the initiative. Talk a little bit about that, if you would, and how you've leveraged all of this. I think it's really interesting.
Well, we start from the point of view of the general public. Most people in Britain, in America, in Europe and elsewhere are fundamentally opposed to trophy hunting. The figures actually are pretty much identical in every country. So, I mean, in the UK, I know that 86% of people want to get rid of all trophy hunting. I was reading a study from just a couple of years ago in the States where the figure was also 86%. And I've seen figures of the same order in Germany as well, which is another country which has both a big hunting industry and a big, you know, hunting culture. But the problem is, you know, we had the whole Cecil furore 5 years ago in 2015, Walter Palmer shot him. And, you know, Jimmy Kimmel was talking about it, and you had all the stars in Hollywood talking about it, and there was anger all over the world. This was one of the biggest stories of all time. It's one of the biggest news stories of all time. And yet so little happened. There was so little change as a result of that. And I guess that was the question that I was asking myself. I said, well, look, I mean, it's very clear that everyone wants this to go, but why haven't things changed? And why, and how do we go about actually creating a process for change? And I mean, there's reasons, and I talk about some of them in my first book, Trophy Hunters Exposed, why there hasn't been change. And one of them is that there's a very, very powerful trophy hunting industry. We don't see it very often, but Safari Club International, which I've referred to before, they've spent $140 million lobbying since the year 2000. That's a lot of money. You know, they've put a lot of money. Well, they made a lot of campaign contributions to the election campaigns of some very senior American politicians. So, for example, you know, Ryan Zinke, when he was running for Congress, he was Donald Trump's first Interior Secretary. The U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, again, when he was running for Congress. Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, John Boehner, when he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and so on and so on and so forth. And they have a PAC, a Political Action Committee, which is bigger than that of some of the biggest corporations in America, like General Motors or American Express, and they openly boast about it. So we've got a pretty powerful industry there. And in fact, one of the biggest donors to Safari Club International is a guy called Steve Chancellor. Now, Steve Chancellor is one of the biggest donors and fundraisers for Donald Trump. And he's also somebody who's won a lot of those Safari Club International prizes that I was telling you about. And he's got a lot of records in the Safari Club records books, which again I was telling you about. And in fact, Steve Chancellor broke the world record for the world's biggest lion ever shot by a trophy hunter. So, you know, there's some very powerful, and there's big corporations. You know, there's Yamaha has been a big sponsor. I mean, the owners of Budweiser and so on. So there's a lot of money being going, and also from the oil industry, as well as, you know, the weapons industry, so the manufacturers of weapons, of rifles and bullets and so on. So it's a powerful and well-funded industry. And when there was a move a few years ago to try to reclassify lions in the, if you like, the Endangered Species League table, because although their numbers have fallen catastrophically, and there's only 20,000 left today, on the IUCN Red List, they're only listed as vulnerable. Indeed, the same happens with polar bears, same happens with leopards, same happens with cheetahs. There's fewer than 7,000 cheetah left in the world. And and the industry has worked very hard to do what it calls either downlisting or delisting, which is basically to remove or reduce the restrictions that may exist on hunting a particular species for sport. Okay. And particularly when it comes to importing that trophy back to the States. So, for example, under the Obama administration, there were a number of species that were added into the Endangered Species Act. And therefore, you couldn't bring those trophies back into the country. A lot of those are now being unwound, and we get back to a position where the US was before. So anyway, we've got a very powerful industry on the one hand, and we've got very strong public opinion on the other hand, but we haven't actually seen this being a sustained issue, because yes, it was a big story at the time, and then it fizzled away. And so I had to sort of find a way to construct a coalition, which included the public, which included the press, which included the politicians, which included the personalities, the celebrities, and bring them all together to create a zeitgeist moment, in effect. Yep. Yes, we've been able to bring together a cross-party coalition of politicians. So, you know, we've had letters and motions in Parliament signed by members of Parliament from all 9 political parties in the House of Commons. And I can tell you, that has never happened. That has never happened before. This is the first time you've had that. And we've had big events where we've had politicians from all of the parties come along. We've had, you know, motions in the House of Commons, in Parliament, you know, debates and so on. And we've got the media very much involved in this as well. And, you know, we've been doing a lot of research into what is the reality of trophy. Because it's also, you know, often portrayed as the, you know, the odd aberrant individual who comes along and does something horrid and nasty. Yeah. But if it's just a bunch of individuals, I mean, it's very easy to legislate against, but it doesn't begin to explain why there hasn't been policy action, and also it doesn't suggest a systemic problem. So we had to try to, if you like, unpack the industry, the sport, what it actually means, how it works, how it lobbies, the impact on animals, and do this in a sustained way, you know, for the media to be able to report, for politicians to be able to ask questions about, for members of the public to sign petitions on, for personalities to get on board and feel that they are, you know, representing and being the voice of the general public and bringing them in front of politicians and bringing the press in front of politicians. So we've had, for example, events in Parliament in the UK where the speakers have included some of the most famous you know, stars in Britain and the editor of a national paper and a government minister all on the same platform. So you're bringing these people together, you know, and so we have created this real head of steam where we are now on the very brink of implementing what the government has promised us is going to be the world's toughest import ban of hunting trophies, going beyond even the ban that the Dutch implemented in 2017, I think it was, which covers 200 species. And so there's been a consultation process. Now, obviously with the virus, a lot of things have come to a stop. Anything that's not coronavirus related, almost in any government at the moment, seems to be, you know, on the back burner. But you know, fortunately, we've now got the support of the media, and they are now pressing the case. They've taken it, the story between the bits themselves. And you know, the Times newspaper, for example, which is probably the most respected newspaper in the world. I mean, it is certainly one of the best known. And so this is the Times of London, and it wrote an editorial about my first book, Trophy Hunters Exposed. I actually don't know if the Times has ever written an editorial about a book before. And yet they wrote one in which they say, look, we absolutely get behind this. The findings in this book are shocking and awful, and we support a complete ban. And, you know, you've got this, you know, right of centre broadsheet, very, you know, conservative, small c conservative, traditional paper. And on the other hand, you've got the sort of left of centre Daily Mirror tabloid, which is kind of the liberal tabloid of it. And they've made an official campaign of this. And, you know, Alison Phillips, the editor, has spoken at our events. They've done about a dozen front page splashes. But they're not the only one. Other newspapers have put this on the front page as well. The Daily Telegraph, which is the most conservative of all the papers, and in fact the one that's very close to the Prime Minister, and they did a front page story just 2 weeks ago about trophy hunting, and again saying, you know, a ban is going to happen. A ban has got to happen. So it's really about creating that alliance and seeing that this is something that everyone in Britain fundamentally sees. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, look, everyone believes that trophy hunting has to be ended. We find a way to visibly express that.
Yep.
And also to build confidence amongst different parties about speaking out. So, if you're a politician and you're suddenly in a room with stars and the media and they're on your side, then you're going to feel more prepared to speak out and actually take action and put in a bill and so on. Similarly, if you're a newspaper editor and you've got a bunch of celebrities who are wanting to give you exclusive quotes and coming together as a group saying we want this to happen, then that's an interesting story. That makes for great copy. And of course, the more that happens, and the more people who are concerned about animal welfare feel, right, this is an issue that we can really all get behind.
Absolutely.
So it almost becomes self-sustaining. But it is about all of those different pieces, bringing them together, so the media, public figures who have a platform of their own and who are, having obviously the support of Ricky Gervais, who's got 14 million followers on Twitter, that gives you a sounding board.
Absolutely.
And then, and the government is now fully behind it. And Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, he has personally tweeted about this. He has spoken in the House of Commons about this. He was the one essentially responsible for that front page story in the Daily Telegraph. We've got this momentum. And I hope that this will serve as something which encourages and inspires people elsewhere to do likewise. Already there's a number of groups in Europe who are starting campaigns very similar to ours, and we're working with them and providing them with evidence and so on, and sharing some of our techniques. And we hope that the same is going to happen everywhere in the States and Canada. I mean, one thing actually a lot of people don't recognize, in Canada is actually the world's biggest exporters of hunting trophies. People think, it's got to be somewhere in Africa, like South Africa. Actually, Canada is the runaway leader because of its huge, absolutely huge bear hunting industry, mainly black bears, but also brown bears, grizzlies, and polar bears. Canada is the only country in the world that allows polar bear trophy hunting. So even the US has banned it. The polar bears in Alaska, they can't be hunted for trophies. The Russians banned it a long time ago, the Norwegians and so on. Only Canada still allows this to go on. So look, this is the beginning of a process that I hope will be taken up by other people, that other people will say, you know what, this really is, of all the issues that is the most senseless, this is one we've got to get behind, and we can win this. And winning it would be so huge. It would mean, we've taken one of the big pressures away from wildlife. It allows us to examine our behavior and our relationship with nature in a very fundamental way. So let's hope that what we managed to create in the UK is something which is the start of something, not the end of something. Because getting a ban in the UK is by no means the end of the process. It's very symbolic, because obviously the UK, England was the country that effectively invented modern day trophy hunting and exported it to the world. So for the UK to be the country that says, you know what, it's time to end this. The country that started it to say it's time to finish it, that carries huge importance. And of course, the UK's ongoing relationship with important Southern African countries like South Africa is such a big player in the industry. If the UK does this, that will be really heard in South Africa, and by extension by other South African nations. Similarly, one would hope that Commonwealth countries like Canada, where trophy hunting is a very big industry, it would also take heed of what the UK is doing and think, maybe this is time for us to examine things as well.
So, you mentioned at the beginning, about sort of attention with COVID and so forth, but it just sparks up my mind, because we did this northern white rhino episode, and we had this part of the discussion where the things we don't, obviously we think about the connections with other animals and so forth, but we forget that these large megafauna, defecate, which worms like to eat, which dragonflies like to eat the worms, which bats like to fly out of caves and eat the dragonflies. And if that, there was an example of a little, as silly a system as that might sound, when the bats can't find that happiness, they go elsewhere. And, there's a bat coronavirus that's killing a lot of people nowadays. And yeah, I see, you thought about, maybe COVID is not a separate issue. Maybe this is all connected, and should be
I think it is.
Yeah,
And
it definitely.
One of the things actually that has come out recently, and there's a professor at Yale University who's been warning about this, is that the canned lion industry could be or could provoke an outbreak of TB in humans. And the reason for this is TB can reside in lion bones. And when you've shot the canned lion, what they generally do, they'll take the head and the skin for the hunter to be able to, make a trophy out of. And then the bones will be sold off to Chinese dealers, Asian dealers for traditional Chinese medicines, or to make lion wine. So and so the TB can be transmitted in that way. Also, when they debone the lion, so they cut off all the animal's flesh, the skin, etc., they quite often or sometimes give that meat to local African villagers, and again, there can be TB transmitted there. So there's all of these, things that we're just not thinking about. I mean, you talk about the important role of different species and how, their defecation. I mean, hippos, for example, which are a very popular animal with trophy hunters, they play a vital role in our ecosystem because they defecate in the water. That creates lilies, that creates oxygenation. So actually, if there weren't hippos, water streams would just die. Literally, water pools and rivers would just die. They'd become overrun with vegetation. Or essentially, they are vital to maintaining a stable ecosystem. And we haven't got it yet. As a human race, we haven't got that. When we're shooting these animals, we're shooting ourselves.
Before I get to the wrap-up question, usually on the show, I typically give the profile of our guest to my young children and see if they have any questions for you. And my daughter, I know this is a little this is a little outside the scope, but my daughter wanted to ask your feelings about whaling. She's very concerned about the whales. I know that's not technically a trophy per se, but there are. Whale hunting is coming back in certain circles. Any views on whales and whale hunting and what's going on there?
Lots, because again, we're doing something which is utterly senseless. And the exclusion that is being used against scientific research is just another loophole. It's so similar to what is happening in relation to trophy hunting. So you can't go and shoot a rhino for its horn or an elephant to shoot its tusk, but you can go and shoot the same elephant for the same tusks and the same rhino for its horns if you say that you're a trophy hunter. So it's again one of these stupid little loopholes which are used malevolently and deliberately. It's not some terrible accident. This is something that has been designed and crafted, and it's what's happening with whaling. And but one of the things that I ultimately want to get to with trophy hunting is abolition through an international treaty, because I don't think CITES in itself. CITES was never designed to be a conservation. It's a wildlife trade regulator. It's a regulated mechanism. We need to have something which is similar to either the Land Mines Convention or indeed the Whaling Convention. Because that has led to a remarkable recovery of blue whales, for example. And it seems to be absolutely senseless to be killing whales in the way that they're being killed at the moment, as it is to be shooting lions, leopards, cheetahs, elephants, and so on. We cannot progress as a society, as a human civilization. We can't call ourselves civilized if we allow these things to continue on our watch. So I completely and utterly empathize with your daughter there. And I have to say, actually, sometimes kids are the best litmus tests of issues because it's black and white for them. Absolutely. And for that reason, we've actually been actually recruiting some youth ambassadors, voices of the young, because ultimately a lot of the problems that will be felt by our inadequacies, our stupidity, will be felt by not our generation, but their generation. But also they have this very clear perspective on matters that sometimes works as a really helpful wake-up call, even for those of us who are working on these issues and who, are living these issues every day. and you put a question to them, and their response is like, "Oh gosh, yeah, that just that explains it completely." You actually just said all that needs to be said about the issue. It really is just that. It's that simple. We don't need to be finding silly politicians' answers or rhetoric around it. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as ABC. So I'm a short answer to your daughter's question. I'm wholeheartedly opposed to whaling. I think it's an absolute catastrophe. I think it's got many parallels with what we're seeing with trophy hunting. And we have to act before it's too late. Fortunately, we're now starting to see some of the benefits of the Whaling Convention. But as we know, because of some of the images that have been coming on social media and on TV just the last few days from around the Faroe Islands and all the rest of it, it's not foolproof. So we need to tighten up. And when we come and make these treaties and conventions, they have to have tough and effective enforcement and verification measures attached to them, and punitive tariffs, because they have to have that deterrent effect. Sure. You know, there's no point saying, well, this is, I mean, one of the problems that we have in Britain at the moment is fox hunting is illegal. Okay, but if you get caught fox hunting, even flagrantly, very few cases that come to court, but if you are, the worst that can happen is that you'll get a fine. So even though the suffering of the animal is just absolutely barbaric, and the sport in itself, and it is horrendous, and Britain outlawed it over 15 years ago, and it still goes on. If you get caught doing it, the worst that can happen is a slap on the wrist. Well, I consider these crimes against nature to be ecocide. This was a term that was developed a few years ago. Essentially, it's a crime against the entire living system of which we are a part. So it's something that should be considered on a par, on a level with genocide. It should be considered as if it were a war crime, because this is a war on nature, a war on our own home, a war on fellow living things, which, as I said before, have as much right to lead a life with dignity and in peace as we do.
Final question, coming back to focus on you, Eduardo. Obviously, you've had a fascinating career. You've met all sorts of people, from diplomats, politicians, celebrities, as we've discussed. We typically ask our guests about sort of the more important influencers, mentors along this path of yours. Anyone that you specifically want to highlight, shout out to at this point, that, you know, if it wasn't for them, Eduardo Goncalves would be off doing something else right now, as opposed to this important direction that you're headed in now.
Wow, that's a difficult question to ask. I mean, there's many people. There's members of my own family who, before 1974, Portugal was under a fascist dictatorship.
Sure.
And some of my family were actively opposed and working to bring that regime to an end. And I think their courage, I suppose their clear-mindedness that, well, if something is wrong, you've got to do something about it, rather than, well, leave this to somebody else to deal with. I don't want to get involved. I mean, politics isn't for me, that kind of attitude. And so I've kind of absorbed some of that. If you see that there's something wrong in the world, then it's your responsibility, your duty to do something about it. Yep. Because it ain't going to change if everyone has the same attitude as you. Right. Everything will stay the same. So I'm not afraid to put my head above the parapet, even though I do get shot at metaphorically a fair bit. Sure. But I think that's an important attitude we need to learn, and I learned it from people within my own family. One of the most inspiring periods of my life was, it's about 22, getting on for 22 years ago, when I actually came over to the States. Actually, it's almost exactly 22 years ago now, and I spent about 6 months in the US. Okay. And so this is 1988, and I met with some extraordinary people, and I went on the 25th anniversary of the Great March on Washington, led by Martin Luther King. Sure. And with Coretta Scott King speaking, and And I interned in Congress and worked with very many, radical grassroots organizations. And I guess because so many of the problems, social and otherwise, in the US are in many cases deeper, more protracted than they are in Europe, which is sort of more comfortable. I mean, there aren't as many rich people, but there aren't as many people who are quite so poor either. We're sort of more around the middle.
Right.
But the US is a much more, it's a much bigger spectrum of a society. Yeah. You have some very, very rich people over here, and you have a lot of people in destitution. And I got involved with a group in DC called the Sojourners. It was led by a radical pastor called Jim Wallace. And there was and they have a magazine, and they, I was ended up being involved in running their food distribution program, and they had all sorts of programs around, oppression of people in Central America, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And it just switched a light on for me, in that it said that anyone can do anything. If there is wrong and injustice in the world, then not only should we do something, but actually we're all empowered to do it. And I guess with my own background as well, so being the son of immigrants, poor immigrants in the UK, and they didn't speak English, and I suffered racism as a child, and then I managed to get into this boarding school where it was I got a scholarship, and so I was kind of mixing with people who were influential or came from influential families, and so one of the people, for example, that I studied politics with between the 16 and the 18 was then the afterwards became a right-hand man to the British Prime Minister, David Cameron. There's another guy I went to the same school with, was the BBC correspondent in Washington for many years, etc., including when Obama came to power. So it was kind of, although I came from a very sort of poor background, I was able, through that education and through those connections, I suppose, to assume a privileged position. And so it has always been, I suppose, a mission to use that privilege and give it back, to pay it forward, if you like. So, for example, there was a period in Britain, I mean, it's not really gone away, but with there's been sort of growing anti-immigrant sentiment in recent years. And a lot of it has been sort of revolving around Europe and Brexit and so on. Sure. And there are some pockets of Portuguese communities in Britain. And one of them is in a little town in the West Midlands called Rugby. And a few years ago, there was a Portuguese restaurant, which was effectively the community centre for the people there, got burned down in a racist attack. And not long after that, I saw an advertisement for a liberal party that wanted, it was the general election coming up, and they wanted to find a candidate who would stand for them in the general election. Okay. So I actually became the first ever general election candidate in the British election of Portuguese origin. And I did it specifically and solely with the intention of speaking out against anti-immigrant sentiment, and of reaching out to the Portuguese community, and of saying that I was there for them, but also that they needed to stand up and be counted. And in fact, after the election, together with a Portuguese councillor in a sort of kind of an assemblyman, if you like, in a part of London, we organised a training event for Portuguese immigrants in Britain on how to get involved in British politics, how to become elected onto their local councils, and so on and so forth. And we'd sort of been teased, actually, by the local authority, where we all booked the room, that nobody would turn up. It was absolutely packed. It was absolutely jam-packed. And part of it was because during that general election campaign a few months earlier, I had pretty much the entirety of Portuguese TV following me around. It really spooked the other candidates as well, because they just assumed this was British TV and that I was some kind of, I was the front runner or something. I absolutely wasn't. But because I sort of had this crew TV, so it got all of this coverage. I remember a cousin ringing me up at night from Portugal. He said, I was just in the cafe just now watching TV, And you came up, and the bloke next to me in the cafe said, "Oh, this guy sounds interesting." And I said to him, "Yeah, he's my cousin, and I didn't know he was doing this." And so, it was quite interesting. So, and actually, it was interesting that it didn't just speak my campaign, my efforts, if you like, didn't just speak to the Portuguese community. I remember this one time I was standing in the high street in the town centre, doing my spiel, giving out some leaflets, trying to talk to people, whatever. And I was given this huge hug by a Russian immigrant. You know, he'd been in this country a couple of years, and he'd been a victim of racist abuse and exclusion and violence even. And you know, he said that what I was saying spoke to him as well. And in fact, he wasn't the only one. There was a Romanian guy I met as well who said the same. So inspirations. I mean, there are many people who I meet actually all the time, who inspire, motivate me. And, you know, were I to think about this properly, I would give you many names and examples. And yeah, I, as well as having interned in Congress, I actually worked in the Houses of Parliament for a while. And, you know, the MP, the member of Parliament that I worked for, was another guy who was very much of, he literally, my first day at work, actually, this was in the summer of 1988, and it was July. It was the end of the parliamentary session. It was literally the last day of Parliament, and so there's an opportunity there for members of Parliament to submit their own debates for anything and anything. And Parliament won't close until all of those debates have been happened. So it'll sit through the night, kind of thing. Anyway, so I'd organised this conference a couple of months earlier about sort of green politics and environmentalism and so on. And he was one of the speakers. And so I'd organised it. He came up to me afterwards, sort of almost cornered me and said, "Eduardo, you're coming to work with me this summer. Here's the address. I'll see you in August," or something like that. It was like, okay. So anyway, I went to work for him. And so my first day was on this last day of the parliamentary session. And he'd managed to secure a debate on sustainable development, and specifically the Brundtland report, which at that time had only just come out. So this is Grover Brundtland's report on sustainable development, which sort of put the challenge out to world leaders for the first time. And he said, "Right, welcome. You're sitting over there. I'm speaking tonight in this debate, which I've moved and has been accepted, and you're writing my speech for me. See you later." So talk about being thrown into the deep end. Anyway, so all day researching and writing, ringing and blah, blah. I put the speech together and it was ready for him. And anyway, so we went into the chamber sort of early evening. Anyway, because it was the last day of the session, it just went on. There were all these other debates that had been lined up and they weren't closing. It was 4 a.m. before he was finally called to speak. And he delivered his speech, my speech, his speech. And then the government minister had to respond. And then there was a few other parliamentarians who debated. And the whole thing was sort of wrapped up by about 4:45, 10 to 5. And then we went off to what was the special cafe for the politicians. In those days, you had stenographers in the gallery, and they would type up what they thought they could hear the politicians say, and then they would give you their notes, and you'd go through it to see if it actually corresponded with what the MP had said and make any changes. So we took those notes and we had this sort of early breakfast, and then we went off and did a couple of other things, went back into the office. So by now it's about 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm hallucinating. I'm so tired, right? Anyway, about 10:30, he can see I'm crumbling. So he says, "All right, that's not a bad day's work, Eduardo. You can go home now." So that was my first day with him. Anyway, so I lasted about a year and a half with him. A lot of people burnt out quite fast, but there was a friend of mine who actually took over my job. And I remember bumping into him in a pub some years later. I said, "Oh, Paul, great to see you. You know, I saw that you took on my job when I left the office of Simon Hughes." He goes, "What was it like?" And he said, "Eduardo, you won't believe my very first day." He basically told the same story that I'd experienced. I'd worked out this was how he had blooded people. You know, this was the ultimate test if you were up to it. And he used to teach us these weird little tricks, like how to be able to stand up next to a wall, prop yourself up for 30 seconds, close your eyes, and that would give you an extra sort of boost of half an hour or so. Anyway, I mean, it was crazy times in many respects, but it got me to learn about the workings of the political system.
Surely.
It got me to understand how these people work, how the parliamentarians work, how the ministers work, how if you want to make change, you need to get onto their wavelength. You have to not just say things to them in a certain way, you really have to put it in a context that feels right to them, that feels like they can own it. Because at the end of the day, it's got to be something which they invented, that they thought of themselves. And it taught me just so much. I was very privileged to have those experiences and to have people who were patient enough, even if sometimes in a slightly crazy way, to teach me that this was, the system. At the end of the day, what I think possibly makes me slightly different from some people in the movement is, look, we can all protest from the margins and from the side. We can make a lot of noise. That ain't going to change things. I'm very interested in the outcome. I'm not outputs driven. I'm outcomes driven. And for that, you have to not complain about the way politicians are, or not complain about the way the mainstream media are, not complain about stars or whatever. You have to think of life from their perspective. How do they see the world, and how can you make this their issue? And fundamentally, that's what we tried to do with the campaign on trophy hunting. And I think that's one of the reasons we've made the progress that we have. And I would certainly implore others who are as concerned about this issue as indeed about any animal welfare issue, or indeed any wildlife conservation, environmental issue, social justice issue, is try and look at it from the policymakers' point of view, from the influencers' point of view. Get inside their heads. One of the things I used to do when I was first in radio was I used to try to visualize this particular reporter that I'd worked with, who I thought just told stories so well. So if I had writer's block, if I was struggling to find the words or the way to express something, I would try to get inside his head. He was called Clive Sutton. He was a journalist from Leeds, radio journalist from Leeds. And I would always say, so how would Clive tell this story? And you kind of have to do the same with a politician. How would X minister put this issue forward if they were promoting it? So, do your research. What are the buttons to press? What's their upbringing or their background or the things that make them tick? So the short answer to your question, who's inspired me most, is really those people who've actually taught me, A, just get up and do it, lose your fears, B, do it from the decision maker's perspective. Think about where they're coming from, then you got a chance of winning.
Wonderful points. Sounds simple, but you definitely you have executed extremely well on these points. I take my hat off to you for that. I have one on. Really fascinating stuff. I'm wishing you the best with it and everything that comes next. For everybody that's going to be watching on the ideaXme YouTube channel or listening on the 12 podcast platforms, everybody, you've been listening to the amazing Eduardo Goncalves, founder of the campaign to ban trophy hunting, doing really amazing things to decrease this cruel, unjustified activity that brings nothing but pain and suffering. Eduardo, thank you for taking the time to come on the show and talk to us for a while. Thank you for everything that you're doing. And as we say on the show, thank you for moving the human story and the human situation forward. This is something that obviously impacts all of us, whether we see it directly or not. And really, really appreciating you sort of making this your issue and the amazing outcomes that you're creating. So thank you.
And thank you so much for having me and for listening to all of this and putting some really interesting questions, actually really making me think and trying to remember and above all, probably thank your daughter